Okay, so for this class, we're going to talk about the implementation of policy. So this is chapter 6 in the textbook. Um, this chapter, the objectives of this chapter are to outline the major steps in the implementation process, discuss the government actors responsible for implementing policy, explain the factors affecting successful policy implementation, compare the procedures policymakers utilize to compare obstacles. And again, once again, as always, I have to point out this is an extremely, idealized version of how the policymaking process works. The, textbook models don't really cover the impact of power or how power sort of influences the policymaking process. And that, essentially there is more or less a permanent bias towards capitalist interests in almost every policymaking decision. But I feel like I've brought that up every single class, so I don't want to repeat myself too much either. So again, the idea of implementation, the set of activities, as it says here, directed towards putting a program into effect. So once the policy has been made, it still has to be put into effect, and there's a lot that can happen during this process. Again, it is a complex process that can take months or years. There are three crucial activities for successful implementation: organization, administration of the program, including resources allocated and personnel assigned, interpretation, how the policy is understood by those responsible for administering it, and then application, how the policy objectives are carried out. So each of these steps can introduce crucial variables in how the policy is implemented. What is the kind of organization of the program? What organizations are sort of being tasked with carrying out the policy can vary. How the policy is obviously understood can vary as well. And then finally, how the policy objectives are actually carried out. There's can be tremendous variability at each steps of this process. Government actors responsible for implementation, the executives, whether it's the president, the governor, or the mayor. Generally, we're talking about policymaking at the federal level, but of course, this goes on at the state and local level as well. Are generally responsible for executing policy via bureaucratic agencies, for example, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, or it could be a state department of transportation. There is a federal department of transportation as well, or it could even just be the local municipal government parks and recreation department, or the Department of Public Works, or whatever it may be, whatever local agencies exist. Executives select agency heads who may be yes men who agree with the executive on program objectives. That they use William Barr, Trump's attorney general, as an example of that. Spokesman for the interests they serve, George Romney, who was a famous auto executive, also father to Mitt Romney, who was a later Republican presidential candidate and senator. Agencies rely on funding from appropriations negotiated between executive and legislative branches. Divided government can constrain agencies. So, if there is a difference between the legislative majority and the party of the executive, this sort of conflict between them can hinder or undermine the effectiveness of these policies or the implementation of these policies due to lack of funding, um, the resistance of the legislative branch even to confirm appointments. Usually these appointments, especially at the head levels of these departments, are confirmed by the Senate, for example, with the federal government. And as has happened in many instances, this is increasingly become a politicized process. So, for example, during the Obama administration, there was significant resistance on the part of the Senate from confirming Obama appointees, for example. Policy success also depends on personnel, buy-in from bureaucrats, meaning how much they essentially support the policy, and protection from overrides due to new executives, legislative changes, or bureaucratic turnover or bureaucrat turnover. So again, a new administration coming in can obviously undermine or even reverse the policies that have previously been implemented. So who implements the policy? This is divided up into three different sections as well. There are the managers, the senior supervisors, and mid-level bureaucrats who assemble the policy, a machine, as they call it, and direct doers. They must favor the policy and have resources, that is, authority, political support, and treasure, meaning basically, funds. They handle horizontal coordination across multiple agencies at the same government level. For example, DACA, DHS, ICE, USCIS, and CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol. Then you have the doers. So you have the managers at the top of the implementation process. Then you have the doers, the so-called street level bureaucrats, or the lower level bureaucrats, essentially. These are the ones who deal directly with clients, teachers, police officers, caseworkers, public defenders. They determine eligibility and oversee treatment. Now, what I'm saying is, I mean that the clients are the teachers and police officers, et cetera, not that they are the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats deal with the teachers, the police officers, et cetera, et cetera. They can hinder implementation via tokenism, appearing to comply but only making a token effort, delaying or providing inferior service, massive resistance, withholding program elements until sanctioned. You also have social entropy, which can be defined as incompetence, inability to implement despite clear directives, for example, due to turnover, variability, systemic approach, unable to handle diverse societal interests, especially with vertical coordination, top-down coordination across multiple levels of government, for example, the No Child Left Behind Act, and coordination problems, which we'll talk about more when we talk about education later on in the class, later on in the semester. Coordination problems, different interpretations or support levels across organizations, primarily horizontal coordination. I believe it was Richard Nixon. In fact, I'm sure it was, who used to refer to the federal bureaucracy as the beast. And this is his basically way of, understanding the complexities of navigating the federal bureaucracy. That even the president of the United States found it very hard, not only to deal with Congress, which is a separate branch of government, but to deal with the bureaucrats who were within the executive branch of government as well. Due to things like this, even when a policy has been clearly authorized, bureaucrats have all sorts of ways of undermining or delaying the implementation of this policy. And Nixon was apparently repeatedly frustrated at many levels, both regarding the Vietnam War, which supposedly he wanted to end, but also dealing with other things, civil rights enforcement, which maybe he was not particularly as strong of a supporter for, but due to existing laws, the bureaucrats within the executive government would still, carry out various programs related to civil rights enforcement and things of that nature. So again, even the president themselves often has a hard time controlling the bureaucracy. Okay, so you have the managers, the doers, and then the fixers, individuals who alleviate tension between managers and doers or solve coordination problems. They anticipate problems, build coalitions, and develop contingency plans. Now you have factors influencing policy implementation. So you have the source of the policy, the president, who can issue executive orders or write memos addressed to various agencies within the federal government. We have Congress, which passes legislation, or the court, which rulings have, again, the force of law as well. In fact, all three of these branches of government can be considered to be, policy makers to some extent or another, as I've covered in a previous class. Implementation is influenced by struggles between president and Congress, for example, appropriations, that is spending basically, and oversight over the rest of the government. So you have the source of the policy, then you have clarity of the policy, the precision of policy intent. Ambiguity gives implementers significant authority. For example, Brown versus Board of Education ordered desegregation with all deliberate speed. But it's precisely the ability to exploit these ambiguities that lead to these kinds of delays and undermining of policy. So of course, as we know, Brown versus Board of Education, which was a ruling made by the Supreme Court in 1954, did not instantaneously uh, end all segregation in the United States, right? I mean, it was at least another 10 years later with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And of course, numerous high profile events, like, for example, President Eisenhower sending troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, to desegregate schools there, with basically, literally calling in the military to help him do it as well. And there are, of course, many other incidents like that during this period of time as well. Then you have support for the policy, requires support from the public and authorities overseeing execution. For example, Congress must appropriate funds for an executive order. You can see, of course, the massive resistance against Trump's immigration policy, although this has not necessarily stopped the federal government from carrying out these ICE raids, despite significant resistance on the part of the public. Complexity of administration requires horizontal and or vertical coordination, which can lead to deviation from original intent, especially with revenue sharing causing competition. So when you talk about horizontal, you mean basically across the federal government. Vertical basically refers to federal, state, and local, right? There's more of a hierarchy there, a top-down hierarchy between federal, state, and local government. Horizontal basically means across the three branches of government at the same level. Then you have incentives for implementers, can include replicating the economic marketplace, private contracting, organizational restructuring, or bureaucratic competition. Resource allocation, adequate appropriations and resources, for example, training, specialized staff, are crucial. Lack of resources can lead to tokenism or massive resistance. Then you have what they call action levers. So you have design levers. So in other words, what lever you have to pull to actually carry out this action, or how well these things are designed to allow for the policy to be carried out. So you have design levers, proposal, imprecision, lack of clarity can sometimes help by preventing opposition from uniting around a single aspect. So literally, if the people don't even know what the policy is about, they're less likely to resist it because they don't understand the negative consequences of it. You have organizational simplification. Policy should minimize the amount of human behavior that needs to be changed. Again, that's very vague, though, of course. But depending on how these things are constructed, this can either hinder or facilitate the implementation of the policy. Then you have operation system levers, startup decisions, length of startup period from authorization to steady state depends on urgency. Factors include learning curves, agency efficiency over time, scheduling, budget cycle, and election cycle. You have public relations decisions, communicating with media, interest groups, and officials. Modern era includes social media and 24-hour news. Media is often adversarial. I don't think that's always true. I think that depends much more on the policy being carried out. And again, to what extent does the policy either support or undermine capitalist interests? If the policy is against capitalist interests, you can usually expect much more opposition from the media, negative coverage of the policy, like single payer healthcare or something like that. Contingency decisions, or when Biden withdrew troops from Afghanistan, right? One of the few times in which the media was really critical of the Biden administration during those early days. Contingency decisions, using alternative scenario planning, 2 bleak scenarios, 1 average, 1 bright. Incentive decisions using cost benefit analysis. Again, we're back to the technical aspects of this, including non-monetary terms like resistance to change to incentivize bureaucrats. So again, these are all things that basically affect the implementation of policy as well. Approaches to successful implementation. There's a top-down approach, forward mapping from policymakers to implementation, best for single policy issues with little coordination, relies on clear objectives and predicting behavior. You have a bottom-up approach, backward mapping from street-level behavior upward, best for broad policies involving multiple agencies with street-level bureaucrats. Then a third generation approach, which combines both. Implementation success relies on clear, credible messages, sufficient resources, and willingness to negotiate. Strategic delay can lead to improved implementation through innovation and policy learning. Once again, they use the case study of the Affordable Care Act. So the source of policy, if we go back to this from a moment ago, the source of policy, the partisan backdrop, Democrats faced staunch opposition. Speaker Boehner, Senator McConnell, the leading Republicans in the House and Senate, respectively. Clarity of policy hindered by misinformation campaigns. For example, Americans for Prosperity and Democrats' inability to deliver a clear message. Support for policy, public disapproval until after Trump took office. State support split along partisan lines. So basically, red states were opposed, blue states generally favored it. Complexity and coordination. Well, let me just take a moment to actually no, I have that on the following slide. Let me jump to that right now. So this is what they're talking about here: support for policy. This is from the textbook. Large shares of the public view the ACA favorably than unfavorably. But as they point out, this is only basically after Trump took office. If you look at the yellow line here, basically the unfavorable rating, according to public opinion polls, was pretty much either equal to or for the most part actually higher than its approval, basically up until Trump took office, and only since then has it been seen in a more favorable light. So that's covering a fairly long period of time, several years, of course. Probably speaks to the fact, of course, that the Affordable Care Act failed to accomplish its basically primary goal of lowering healthcare costs, and it still left millions of people, tens of millions of people, without health insurance. Complexity and coordination involve federal and state governments, governors, insurance commissioners, Medicaid directors. HHS acted as intermediary. The Medicaid expansion, the mandate, the requirement to expand Medicaid was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, leaving expansion to the states. As of 2019, 14 states opted out. That is actually a bit higher now. Incentives and resource allocation. Federal government paid 100% of expansion costs, or I mean that's a bit lower. I'll switch to my web browser in a second to show that. Resource incentives and resource allocation. Federal government paid 100% of expansion costs between 2014 and 2016, gradually dropping to 90%. Individual incentives included protections for pre-existing conditions, no lifetime limits, and allowing young adults to stay on parents' insurance until 26, which is funny because there are plenty of people that are now living with their parents well into their 30s, in fact. Let me switch over here for a second. And then also switch here. let me now switch here. I'll get back to that table in a moment, but this is basically the states that have opted out of Medicaid. So not adopted 10 states. You can see basically the 10 states here, adopted and implemented 41 states, including DC. So basically the states that opted out are mostly the red states, the southern states, as well as a few others. But even some of the normally red states have opted in, basically because people realize the benefit of an expansion of Medicaid for them as well. I could provide a link to this if you want to read more about this, because it provides a little more detail over the adoption or the expansion of Medicaid within these states here. But anyway, of course, another thing that needs to be talked about is that in Trump's recent budget, significantly cuts spending on Medicaid, something which, of course, he promised not to do, just like he promised he would never go to war with Iran. But he has. And again, we're talking about maybe like tens of millions of people losing their health insurance. Now, the law has already been passed, but again, it has not fully been implemented yet. So we are the implementation process is kind of ongoing. So we haven't really seen the full consequence of this yet, as well. The ACA relied on both federal and state governments to successfully implement the law involving all 50 state governors, insurance commissioners, and Medicaid directors. These were the doers. This is kind of building on what I just said a moment ago or in the previous slide. State support for implementation was drawn along partisan lines. The ACA contained provisions left up to the states, establishing insurance exchanges, expanding Medicaid. Now, there are basically three different types of insurance exchanges that exist. There are the state-based marketplace, where the state performs all functions. Consumers apply on state-maintained websites, for example, California, Colorado, and Connecticut. You have a state-based marketplace with a federal platform. Functions same as the state-based marketplace, but consumers use healthcare.gov to enroll. And then finally, you have the federally facilitated marketplace. HHS performs, that's Health and Human Services, which is now under the control of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. HHS performs all functions. Consumers apply via healthcare.gov. Now, it was too long to include in the PowerPoint, but if you go to page 119 in the textbook, you basically see a complete table listing all the states and basically what kind of insurance exchange that they have. So if you're curious, and whether or not they expanded Medicaid or not. Now again, they list 14 states. When this was written, it's since been updated. Like I said, so states like New Jersey uses the state-based marketplace with a federal platform. New York just uses the state-based marketplace. And you can see various other states as well. So again, policy implementation is a complex process involving coordination between individuals, agencies, and policymakers. Managers, doers, and fixers are at the heart of the implementation process, moving a policy from legislation or executive order into something tangible. The implementation machinery produces policy at different speeds and with varying success rates based on several factors: broad public support, favorable policy source, adequate resources, and administrative costs and burdens. A policy can stall prior to implementation, even if it has broad support, a favorable source, and secured resources if administrative costs and burdens are too great. And of course, once again, there's no discussion here about how this impacts capitalist interests or the interests of the capitalist class, which tend to have the greatest influence over policymaking. Conversely, a policy can be straightforward and require minimal effort to implement, yet never get passed if there's little political and or public support. Therefore, policymakers must continuously work the four primary levers: design, operating system, organizational, and political, to keep the implementation machinery operational. All right, so that pretty much covers that. Pretty straightforward. Again, I won't belabor some of the points I've already made in previous classes, but of course that all still applies here as well. So that's it, everyone. So take care.